I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector Podcast. And I have joining me a longtime friend and constant contributor, Chris Temple of the National Investor. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Hey, Mike, good to be here as always.
Yeah, well, it's the day after the Fed, and I was expecting it to be a non-event yesterday, and boy, was I wrong.
Well, going into this, I have been musing for a while what it's going to take to wake up the markets, specifically in the country generally, to the fact that economically and financially, Donald Trump is not going to have much of a honeymoon, if at all, once he's sworn in. He's had a bit of one recently in most respects, but he is going to take office with a $36 trillion and counting existing national debt that's on, that we know about. There's, however many multiple tens of trillions more of unfunded liabilities and mandates and so forth that don't end up in that number. This year, if you annualize the first 2 months of the fiscal year 2025 will add 3+ trillion more to that. And the bond market increasingly smells that. More and more of the bond market vigilantes are resurrecting like zombies in a grade B Hollywood movie. And we also see inflation now for the last few months turning upward again, not going down. The way in which yesterday Jerome Powell tried to sort all that out and lay the groundwork for, I believe, as things appear right now, no more rate cuts in 2025. They officially went from 4 to 2. The Fed futures market is down more to like 1. This is not going to be a pretty situation that the president is going to be stepping into. He's going to be facing newly rising inflation, newly rising interest rates. And 5 minutes after he takes the oath of office and finishes his inauguration speech, at least the establishment press in the U.S. is going to assign every single statistic from that point on to him. And it ain't going to be pretty. It's not going to make for a good environment in which to try and pursue a pro-growth agenda, to cut taxes, which he's already run up the white flag on extending his tax cuts early in the administration. That's not been understood nearly enough yet. So it's not going to be a good story. And there will be this reemergence, I'm sure, at some point, maybe not until after the inauguration, where Trump decides to join a more public battle with Jerome Powell over policy, which isn't going to get him anywhere. So, right now we're seeing the first fruits of what is going to be a reality check that is going to come about in a much bigger way over the coming weeks and few months, where the markets finally wake up. Holy cow, interest rates aren't going back down to 0 or 1 or 2%. Inflation's not going back to 2%. It's going the other way. And we're in a lot of hurt with all of this debt and correspondingly less and less real growth that's going to support it.
I remember very vividly you were one of the three guests I had back in December or back in October prior to the election, where we discussed the possible policies on either a Harris presidency or a Trump presidency, and it was in the podcast with you where I posited the notion of, why does either one of these people want this job? All this is baked in the cake, and they're essentially doomed.
Yeah, and look, the comparison that I made was, there have been two notable times in my lifetime where a president came into office and really had their whole agenda and or makeup of their presidency impacted by what they inherited. The first time was Jimmy Carter in the 70s, who, and I've said this before and I'll always say it again, even though I'm much more of a conservative, or actually paleo conservative as they call them, Republican pretty much my whole life. I still stick up for Jimmy Carter because he has the worst bum rap of any president of my life, because the inflation and whatnot that he presided over in the late 70s and into 1980 was not his doing. It was the doing of Richard Nixon and Nixon's Fed chairman, Arthur Burns, prior. But Jimmy Carter is saddled with that. In more recent times, relatively speaking, when Bill Clinton was elected, he had a very somewhat aggressive, I'd say, progressive agenda. His wife was licking her chops over taking over the country's health care back then, which never got off the ground for a lot of reasons. And Clinton himself ended up becoming much more of a centrist and pragmatist, Rockefeller Republican in many ways politically, to the point where by the time he left, true liberals and progressives hated both his guts and his wife, the Hildebeest, and that legacy cost Al Gore the election in 2000. And what happened to cause that, Mike, was that as soon as he got elected, there was a renewed inflation scare. And the Fed was raising interest rates, which is one of the ways that Bill Clinton got in the first place, because raising interest rates hurt George Herbert Walker Bush when he was running for re-election, and he made sure the whole world heard his gripes about that. That the Greenspan at the time raising rates into his re-election effort cost him that. But it also impacted Clinton to the point where, one of Clinton's more better known hatchet men politically, cue ball Jim Carville, mused famously, and I've repeated this a few times recently because it's appropriate today. He said, I used to think, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the quote right in front of me. He said, I used to say that if I was ever reincarnated, I'd like to come back as the Pope or as this or that. But I changed my mind. I want to come back as the bond market because then you can control and scare the hell out of everybody. And he said that because it was the bond market vigilantes rebelling back at that time as Greenspan was raising rates to try and fight off what at the time was a resurgence of inflation that completely upended all of Clinton's own spending and economic growth plans and stuff like that, and turned him into more of it sounds funny today to say it, but more of a fiscal conservative and a pragmatist. So this is the curse, the Carter curse, to a lesser extent, maybe the Clinton curse that President Trump is stepping back into come January 20th. And I've said many a time, and you and I have talked about it, we will further, if he doesn't think and act outside the box, and he thinks that it's merely going to be warmed over trickle down economics and getting rid of some regulations and other things that hamstring the economy, and I'm not against either of those, is part of an overall program. But if that's all he's going to do, I'll tell you right today, his presidency has failed before it starts.
Yeah, there's just way too much cooked in the system right now to, even know where to start to unravel stuff. That was, there's a couple things that came out of that discussion there. One was that I was shocked after the election, not that Trump won. It was, that was a highly probable likelihood because whatever was going to happen in the swing states, they were all going to break one way or the other, and that was going to be what the election rode on, and they did. They all broke towards Trump. But the post-election reaction to that in the markets, with the overabundant ebullience that entered the market, when I'm looking at it, going like, you think he's got, no, he can't without Congress. No, he can't without Congress. No, he can't without Congress. And I'm looking, going, okay, at some point in time, the markets are going to realize that, he's going to need help in order to get this agenda through. And he doesn't necessarily have the congressional support to be able to make it happen in a lot of ways. So that was the one thing. And then the other thing, you talked about the bond vigilantes and Carver's famous quote, but lost in yesterday's post-Fed rhetoric, everyone noticed the Dow tanking, but they didn't notice what happened in the bond market. So, Chris, enlighten people. What happened in the bond market yesterday?
This is the single most ominous factoid, I think, from yesterday. Now it's being tainted a little bit, you can argue, by this renewed angst over whether there might be a quasi quote government shutdown this weekend in Washington because the monstrosity of a spending bill, as it was euphemistically but disingenuously called, it was being forced through by House Speaker Mike Johnson, a straight POS, if there ever was one, who has had the gall recently to always want to be at President Trump's elbow and act like he's one of the players, but now is carrying water for Biden and Chuck Schumer. I mean, that was just ridiculous. But that's hurt the bond market a little bit too. But by far the bigger impulse is that the bond market is pretty much being truthful, where Powell himself, the Fed generally, and Powell himself specifically in his press conference afterwards, was trying to talk out of both sides of his mouth on inflation. The bond market knows inflation is going back up. The last 2 or 3 months has not been just a blip or bumpy patch in the road on the way down to 2%, which I've said it many times before, and I'll say it again. The only way we get to sustainable 2% inflation is a major economic implosion in this country or in the world. And then we go down there or lower for a little while. But the bond market, when the Fed is acting more hawkish, like they may not be cutting rates further to support the economy or to stave off a recession or whatever, in that context, you expect to see most of what we saw yesterday. The dollar goes up. The dollar is at yet another new cycle high since this year, really. You see metals go down because of both the dollar strength and worries about economic growth. That, check that box. That's what's supposed to happen. Grossly overpriced stock market also corrects. That's supposed to happen, so check. But the one thing that's not supposed to happen, and historically doesn't in that context, is that long-term interest rates also go up. They tend to go down when the Fed does something perceived to be as hawkish or as less supportive. And instead, they shot a lot higher. And as of this morning, I looked at it shortly before you and I started recording. We were at 455 on a 10-year note, so decidedly higher than the peak in the rebound in yields of several weeks ago. And now within a whisker of the 2024 peak for the 10-year Treasury earlier in the year, which was around 4.7-ish%. And then one more whisker, we're back up to the high period for this rebound in interest rates of the last few years, which for the 10-year Treasury was, and I don't again have the chart in front of me, but right at about 5%. And the shit's really going to hit the fan if this rise in long-term yields doesn't slow down pretty soon. I mean, it's been astonishing to me that the markets to this point have ignored both the surge in the dollar and rising yields and have kept bidding up, the broad market averages. But there's a couple of more big cracks in that now, and you may still get the seasonal benefit of a so-called Santa Claus rally. There might be a couple of data prints or something come out that'll make the markets a little bit less panicky than they already are. But this is the first fruits, in my opinion, of all markets coming back a bit more toward reality after this, crazy rally that we've had post-election. And we're going to see, I think, a lot more of that into the early part of the new year when everybody has to come to grips even more with the fact that the president's agenda is already, in some jeopardy before he even gets in there, not only because of the very thin political margin that he has, but because of the fact that if he doesn't think and act outside the box from the get-go, that the existing levels of debt, the existing constraints put on him by both the markets and increasingly it's going to be by the Federal Reserve as well, he's not going to get a whole hell of a lot accomplished.
No, and you alluded to the threat of shutdown of the government. if that were to occur, who's going to take the blame at this point?
Well, the establishment media wants to say that, of course, that it's the Republicans and Trump, and they always want to shut it down. I'll tell you what, though, and I'll go back to the Clinton years. In times past, one of my past lives, when I did some politicking and lobbying on Capitol Hill, and on a couple occasions knocked heads with the agenda of then House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Mr. Newt did a lot of good things while he was House Speaker. One of those is he reminded a journalist in an interview I watched last night was that on a few occasions he threw down the gauntlet and stood his ground and said, no, if it takes a government shutdown to straighten some of this stuff out and to get rid of some of the lunacy in the federal budget, then that's what we're going to do. And there were a few different times back then that the government was, quote, shut down. Now, you still have a lot of key things paid for. All of the talks anytime for years of a government shutdown and all this kind of stuff. It's all hysteria that's whipped up by the media more so than not over, the civilization is going to end if the federal government doesn't have a budget. No, I think it was Will Rogers famously said that our wallets and liberties are both safe until the Congress is back in session. And people who aren't impacted by all of this hysteria in the media realize that there's more good than bad to come out of a government shutdown. And he pointed that out, Gingrich did, and in fact pointed out that because on a number of occasions he stood his ground against President Clinton and would not countenance wasteful spending and all of this pork and so forth, that the likes of current House Speaker Mike Johnson are only too happy to endorse and enable. We had the closest thing to a balanced budget that we've had in all of our lifetimes as a result of that back then. Now, you've got to put an asterisk next to some Democrats who think Clinton was an economic genius, to do that, because part of the reason why there was a nominal surplus for a year or so back in the 90s was because, thanks to Reagan era legislation in the 80s, the feds count as part of the overall budget picture the Social Security surplus every year that they morph into the whole budget. So if you've got, the way that they report it is that if overall the federal budget is running at $100 billion deficit back then, but this year there's $150 billion surplus in Social Security, which we're told is separate, which is a lie, is a matter of law if you look at the U.S. codes. But if you had $150 billion surplus ostensibly in a Social Security trust fund, they will report that, hey, huzzah, we had a $50 billion budget surplus this year, only because they took from Social Security. But I digress. The point being that however you want to look at it on either side of that, the federal budget was the best it's been in any of our lifetimes because Newt Gingrich shut the government down several times to lead to that conclusion. So I think that with the platform and the bully pulpit that President Trump has, and the way in which all of the just stupid, duplicitous, wasteful stuff was trickling out steadily yesterday, one after the other on social media, thanks chiefly to Elon Musk. Again, a lot of people have seen what it is that House Speaker Mike Johnson, a so-called Republican, he's not, and what Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden, or whoever acts for Joe Biden these days, what they were trying to do, rush in there before the Christmas holiday, funding bioweapons labs, allowing renewed censorship of social media by the State Department, and so many other odious things that voters voted against, besides the wasteful spending. All of that stuff they were trying to get in, that all got pushed back. So that was a good development, and I think armed with that kind of information, if I was President Trump, I would be coming right out and saying, look, we're either going to have a slimmed down basic continuing resolution just to fund basic government until January, or go ahead and shut the government down. We'll figure it out in January. And I think net, even though there would be a lot of shrieking and wailing and gnashing of teeth, net, he and the Republicans that stand behind that strategy would end up heroes rather than the opposite.
provided they actually get their agenda across the line by that tactic. If
Well,
you know, if they shut the government down and nothing changes, they go from hero to zero pretty quick.
well, that might be the case, but again, the way that these things work, Mike, is that when you hear the term government shutdown, the picture everybody gets of, the military all goes, to the pool hall or to the park or to the beach, or they stay home and twiddle themselves, and now everybody can come and invade the U.S. Okay, or Social Security recipients don't get their check, or veterans don't get their check, and everything. That doesn't happen. It's silly, and it's more, and this is typical in the media. The media always lies and obfuscates and stuff, along with the political, animals in Washington, and it's always over. They've got lots and lots, far, far, far too much in the form of money and power, and it's to them it's hysterical and an existential threat. If anything is going to threaten that, even if the life of the average American, not to mention our national balance statement, will be better off as a result.
No argument from here. I'm a big believer in small government, so it's whatever gets us there. But as I say, I've seen too many of these battles where they fight the battle and nothing seems to change on the outside of it. So,
Yeah.
but I want to take the next bit of this conversation and run it off in two different directions, but ultimately they're related. We've talked about Fed policy up until this point. Let's talk about Trump and what Trump would like to do, and then how Fed policy is going to affect that. And then, dare I say the R word here, recession, because we're still in danger of one. But nobody seems to be wanting to talk about the R word in the room. So let's talk about Trump, the mercantilist, and Trump's favorite words: tariff, 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 and how that's going to affect the economy, and how that's going to run counter to Fed policy.
Wow, lots there. I'll see if I can make this somewhat succinct. Generally speaking, Trump's core economic agenda, which in theory, agree with pretty much all of it. In practice, a lot of it is inherently contradictory. But again, the big picture, I like what he's about or claims to be about. He wants to see America return to a much greater level of self-sufficiency, not just with this drill baby drill idea of adding even more energy production and so forth to the mix to theoretically bring overall costs down, including energy costs down. There's a lot wrong with that to begin with, but again, it's well intentioned, even if he doesn't understand the math behind it all. But he wants to do that. He realizes that with the new world we're in, partly, but not by any means exclusively, thanks to him going back to his first term as well, we are in a world that is in retreat from globalization, where economic relationships and whatnot are increasingly going to involve uh, things that you do within your own four walls or with your neighbors if you get along with them in the closest geographical proximity. And that's for a whole host of reasons. And that frankly started even before all the talk about tariffs and stuff. Don't forget that for years now, a lot of global do-gooders and NGOs and think tanks and so forth have been proposing, and in some areas like the EU, they have already enacted taxation regimes that, among other things, penalize an importer with a tax based on how far stuff had to travel before you imported it. And that has nothing to do with protectionism. That has nothing to do with any of this. This is all part of the whole green agenda globally, where they want to burn less fuel, meaning that you don't transport stuff as far, meaning that you start doing some of these things in your own country if you can. So this is a much broader based impetus than what we've seen add to this since then in a form of Trump's type of trade policies. Other countries, either in retaliation or on their own initiative, enacting similar ones. The whole thing about strategic and national security vulnerabilities, which we've seen more so in the U.S. recently, everything from Russia embargoing enriched uranium to China, embargoing or prohibiting the exports of a whole host of rare earth elements, antimony, and things like that. So these things were already started. And so Trump, at least what he articulates in big picture form of wanting to, quote, make America great again, unquote, by jump-starting our own largely mothballed industries in America, that's 110% for all of that. That's great. In imposing tariffs on competitors or would-be competitors of those industries until we get them going, that's a mixed question because there's some areas I think where that's unrealistic, largely because of the cost structure of things. And that's a whole separate argument. And I'll be putting out some stuff in the near term myself with the national investor and with our media company to talk about some of these policy things and what people should rally behind policy wise and what people should expect economic and investment wise on all this stuff. Some of the good stuff that is more directly within the control of the president is where he can do a lot and seems very ready to do so to get rid of a lot of duplicitous regulations, all the red tape and so forth. That is a big part of the reason why the U.S. cannot compete with countries like China. By far and away, the most important nomination, in my opinion, that the president has made is Doug Burgum, the governor of North Dakota. He has nominated Burgum to be the Interior Secretary. Now, Interior is the one that's over all federal lands, all the regulations tied to them, whether it comes to mineral extraction, exploration, or pretty much anything else on federal land. So immediately we're going to see a polar opposite in attitude from the Interior Secretary that we've been cursed with for the last 4 years. That's number one. Number two, Burgum is going to be a super czar, if you will, a new position over not only his own Interior Department, but over the Energy Department, which is going to have its own very good secretary in Chris Wright, the EPA, which will also have a good secretary under Lee Zeldin, and similar agencies and efforts. So anything to do with permitting, environmental regulations, the ability to have endless lawsuits against things, how long it takes to get permits and so forth. All of that is going to end up way, 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 way better. The third hat that Burgum is going to be wearing is that he will be sitting on Trump's National Security Council. And that tells you just how much President Trump, with this part of his agenda to make America not only independent where it comes to crude oil and natural gas production. And of course, crude oil, we still import a lot because of the refineries and whatnot. That's a different discussion. Natural gas, of course, we're more directly independent. But we want to be able to produce our own copper and nickel and lithium and antimony and so many other things. And this appointment of Burgum is going to go a long way towards helping that happen. But there are still the economic aspects of this. How do you create an environment where you have price certainty so that when it comes to the private sector, for example, putting up the big chunks of dough to develop a new lithium project or antimony project or nickel project, how do they have price certainty? What is the overall industrial game plan that is going to make all of this happen? Trump has said virtually nothing about any of this. Doesn't mean he doesn't have any game plan for it, but he thinks that just changing the regulations is going to magically make all this happen. It won't, and he's got to go a lot farther. So that's that subject. To the broader trade policy, Mike, and his underlying philosophy of mercantilism, what's going to be really curious to see early in a new year is how far the markets come toward his desires. And I don't think this dog just isn't going to hunt, to use that old expression. You cannot have a situation where we have inflation rising and yet you're going to get browbeat or somehow bring about the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates aggressively, bringing the value of the US dollar down aggressively versus other countries, and enabling you to export more US production. That going down that road at all is completely unrealistic based on current dynamics and based on the laws of mathematics. And it's why I've been increasingly getting behind monetary alternatives that will allow the president to be able to build and rebuild our industries without having to rely on this landscape, which is not in any way, shape, or form going to be in favor of his agenda. And again, his agenda is good for the future of this country. It's good in that if he does everything that he needs to implement it, we'll have millions more good, high-paying jobs, people that will, instead of going to school to get a liberal arts degree to learn how to carry a protest sign or become Mike instead of Michelle or Michelle instead of Mike and all this kind of stuff. We'll have kids going to trade schools, funded, for example, by an infrastructure bank, one of the initiatives I'm behind, that will fund those trade schools. So we have people that are able to work in the new copper projects, fixing our power grid, fixing our roads and bridges, et cetera. All of these things have to happen. And I hope the president's going to come around to this broad acceptance of all of the pieces of the puzzle he's going to need to implement. The problem is what I hear out of his mouth most of the time is just too much garden variety trickle down Republican orthodoxy, and that's not going to cut it.
No, and these Trump policies seem to go contrary to the Fed, as you referred to with on the mercantilism side of things. How long before there's actual well, there is already bad blood between Powell and Trump, but how long before that spills out into the open?
Well, look, Powell, first off, Trump recently, I think to try and number one, diffuse this as being an issue anymore than it's going to be eventually. And number two, because he's got other fish to fry right now, trying to get his nominees in and stuff. He figures, all right, in the grand scheme of things, getting in any kind of a public fight, and trying to spend the bandwidth on fighting Powell publicly is just dumb right now. So at least he gets that. And he already came out and said, no, I'm not going to try and remove Powell, when I get in the White House, which he legally can't do without Congress changing the Federal Reserve Act, number one. Number two, that also raises the question of, what comes later. I mean, Powell's term ends in January of 2028. So for 3 out of Trump's 4 years in office, Jay Powell is going to be his Fed chairman. It's been suggested that it kind of like what Trump is doing now, even though Biden is officially still the president. It's been suggested that Trump can find a powerful figure more to his liking that he nominates well before Powell's term is over. And that person will be a constant, shadow over Powell in the markets. He'll I forget what the term is people like to use on social media, but he's always going to be badgering the current Fed chairman. If a new one gets named at least well before Powell's term is up. But anyway, aside from that, what Trump needs to goose, and he made this very plain in his first term, even though the dynamics are somewhat different right now, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, Mike, Trump needs a weak U.S. dollar and low U.S. interest rates, he thinks, to grow the economy and to enable greater levels of U.S. exports to the world. And there's a little bit of truth to that. But the problem with trying to do these things today in most industries is that, back in the Industrial Revolution, when you had, for example, a well-regarded Republican businessman as president back then, William McKinley, who Trump and his team have loved to compare themselves to. McKinley was in a place where we had at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution a lot of newly emerging industries throughout the U.S. And tariffs were used as a means by him to protect those industries as they grew from cheaper competition in those days, mostly from Europe, of dumping steel and iron ore and whatever into the U.S. And it worked. And it was the right recipe for that time, let alone a substantial revenue raiser for the government. Likewise, and this is key to comparing it to today and doing so honestly and accurately, back then, by and large, the tariffs on imported goods did not have a direct and immediate and negative impact on the average American consumer who did not buy their sneakers and electronic devices and even food from other countries. They do today. So the president and his people are going to have to be careful in how they compare the present time to then, because today, if you're going to enact or reenact or strengthen, as the case may be, and there'd be all three probably, tariffs on goods that we import into the country, it will be an immediate negative tax, a regressive one, the most regressive one, frankly, next to a sales tax that you can have on the average American consumer. And it's going to broaden the percentage of the population in the US that is feeling the pinch, like, contrary to the economic numbers, including this morning, where I think it was a final number on Q3 GDP is 3.1%. Well, 50 or 60% of this country thinks you're smoking something illegal when you say that we got great 3% growth, because they're living paycheck to paycheck and hand to mouth. And adding tariffs to that equation will turn that 50 to 60% into 60 to 70% or worse, as far as the number of people who are going to feel living costs going in the wrong direction. And as far as industries, and I'll stop rambling and let you get back in here. As far as industries, and I'll use simply the electric vehicle industry as one example, we have only the beginnings of an EV industry in the U.S. Now, I think that the news of its demise is greatly exaggerated, but things are going to be more sober and realistic going forward. But here again, you've got so many different moving parts in the equation. It is mathematically and logistically an impossibility. I don't care how high tariff you put on them for the U.S. EV industry to compete with China's. All of their costs and inputs are cheaper across the board. They're tooled up for it. They're better at it. They've got all of the pieces of the food chain in there. We don't. Thanks in large part to President Biden, who is leaving office with us farther behind the ability to compete with China than when he started. And in that context, what the president again needs to look at is not just his doctrinaire thing. Well, all right, if that's not going to work, I'll do 200% tariffs on Chinese EVs instead of 100%. Doesn't matter. I'll crack down on Mexico so China can't ship EVs from there and say they're made in Mexico rather than in China. That doesn't work either. What you need to do is realize that if we're serious about moving forward as a more insular economy than what we have been in a lot of decades, is that we forget about China and we set up the policy and legal and banking framework to where we can all live with an EV that might cost on average twice as much as China, because we have supported prices that need to be supported, and on the other end made sure we've raised wages for people in this country so that they can afford that higher cost EV. I know that's a big mouthful. I know that's a lot of stuff, but I've gone through all of it to say basically that though Trump's instincts, as usual, and what he says he wants to accomplish, as usual, are pretty good, he really is lacking when it comes to how they're going to be implemented today, based on everything working against them. The worst being, of course, back to the Fed. So, he'll get in public pissing contests with Jerome Powell to his detriment as time goes on. I don't think that's going to help him. And what he needs to do is figure out how to make all of this work without the Fed. And there are multiple ways to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a lot to unpack there. There's a couple of things. Yeah, I often liken Trump to my mother in a lot of ways. My mother was really good at pointing out what was wrong with the world, but she never had a proper solution to fix it.
And that's where this guy is, regrettably. Yeah. I mean, he's got solutions for some things, and unlike his first term, one of the things I've liked most about the recent past is that he has surrounded himself with younger and smarter and far more capable people than the swamp creatures he was recycling his first go around.
Yeah, and the other thing that I took out of that answer, when you were talking about, comparing to McKinley, Trump even needs to look and compare the tariff strategy to his first term versus the second term. In the first term, he was in a very low inflation environment. Tariffs were going to have a pretty negligible effect on the inflation rate in that type of environment. But, we've come out of a pretty high inflation rate environment. COVID has made the supply chain, very awkward, and there's, higher costs associated with that. And if the tariffs come in and mess any of those things up, the inflation hit on those could be a lot greater this time around than they were the first time. So just because it worked the first time doesn't mean it's going to work this time.
I'm glad you said that because it brings us back to what the Fed did yesterday, and we need to talk about the market consequences going forward and how investors need to zig or zag, as the case may be. But Mike, the single most disingenuous thing that Powell said yesterday in an overall disingenuous press conference that was the worst in that regard of any, with the possible exception of late in 2019, when he was dancing around the reasons why he was throwing hundreds of billions of dollars into the overnight repo market, when there was a crisis developing in the banking system that nobody really understood. And then it all was moot a few months later with the onset of COVID, and then he could do it out in broad daylight and add a zero to it, just throw money at everything. Okay. But with that possible exception in late 2019, this was the worst example of Powell talking out of both sides of his mouth on so many issues. But I wanted to talk about the worst example, and that was when he was questioned about tariffs. Is the Fed going to take into account the fiscal situation and specifically the imposition of tariffs and their impact, real or not, when they figure out monetary policy in 2025 and beyond? And his answer was, in going back to 2018, and I forget which reporter it was, but that asked him about this, but she brought this up. He said, in 2018 we had this, study within the Fed of what impact the tariffs were going to have specifically on the inflation equation, and would it be sufficient as far as tariffs being inflationary, that we were going to need to, have some monetary policy response to it that we wouldn't have done otherwise. And he said, basically, no, we talked about it. That study is still on the table. The framework is still on the table. But he said, as far as what they're going to do right now going forward, he said, quote, "This is not a question that's in front of us right now," end quote. He's a damn liar. Okay. Because in other parts of his press conference, he made very clear about what is coming because of price pressures in part involved with tariffs. Number one, he's said that this 2018 study is on the shelf. If they think they need to take it off the shelf, it at least puts them in a position to respond to it. But here's the most disingenuous thing about it, and you kind of gave a big part of the answer already. In 2018, there were a couple of differences between then and now. Back in 2018, we still were in an environment of inflation kind of bumping along 2%. What tariffs did to change that equation wasn't going to matter a whole hell of a lot. You didn't have the underlying inflationary impulse you do today. Today you have that underlying inflationary impulse. And that's a big difference already between then and now. And the biggest single cause of that was this lying so-and-so at the podium yesterday trying to tell you he, again, has nothing to do with it. I don't know if you remember, Mike, I did a cartoon of Powell, which I'm going to have to resurrect, on this discussion. You remember in the Blues Brothers where Jake gets caught by Carrie Fisher underneath in a culvert when he and Elwood are trying to get away from the concert, and Carrie Fisher is there with a machine gun pointed at him and talking about how he stood her up at the altar. And Jake's response, was, my tux didn't come back from the cleaner. I had a flat tire. If an old friend came in from out of town, it wasn't my fault, I swear to God. Well, that's what Powell tells us repeatedly, including this lying sack of shit yesterday. Okay? Because he never, ever, ever, ever has it been the Fed's fault to create 30% of all the US dollars ever brought into being inside of 2 years. It's never been his fault. And anytime it comes up, it was Russia invading Ukraine. It was price gouging. It was COVID. It was this and that. It wasn't my fault, I swear to God. That's what we hear from Powell constantly. And so when the bond market vigilantes really have a gun to his head, and he's going to have to react because of all the still lingering malady of all of that monetary inflation and the fact that monetary growth is still been on an upswing for a while. And the Fed has to come out and give us the second part of what he refused to give us yesterday. And instead of cutting down the expected number of rate cuts for 2025 from 4 to 2, he goes from 2 to 0. Okay. It's not going to be his fault. It's going to be, well, we see the fiscal thing coming now, and Trump is going to eventually want to try and push Congress to extend his tax cuts, and he's done this and this, and we have his tariff policy. So, gee, all of that stuff is making inflation go back up even more than we thought. Okay, and now we can't cut rates at all. So that's what we're going to come down to. So this is a Fed chairman who is trying as best as he can to have things both ways, worse than anybody. I mean, I used to give Powell credit for at least being half understandable. And if you want to give him a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt, Mike, maybe you compare him in some ways to what I said earlier about Carter or even Bill Clinton. He's at the helm of a central bank that is fatally flawed just by its nature. Okay, and will one of these days inevitably finally lead to a crisis, a big one, because an unsustainable open-ended fractional reserve system does not work forever as a matter of simple mathematics. But the way in which he is trying to dismiss his role in that and get us to look at all of these different bogeymen other than him, it's beyond the pale. And the man is not that stupid. Janet Yellen, she is that stupid. She's a policy wonk, and she among bankers is like Kamala Harris was as a politician, just an empty head, empty suit, does what she's told, plays the game for the establishment. Powell's not that dumb. He's just disingenuous.
Yeah, well, I referenced my mother earlier. Let's reference my dad, who says, if you don't know what you're doing, don't monkey with it. And
Mine used to say the same thing, Mike.
I see it happening on both sides, the Fed and this administration, where they're going to start monkeying with stuff. And I asked the recession question earlier. Does that finally break things and we actually end up with the recession that's been long overdue?
Well, look, inevitably, I think that does happen, and it could be a massive crisis, given that yet again we've had a massive bubble in the markets that has led us to it. People always need to keep in the back of their mind that I've explained this many times over many years, that along about the early 80s, the most misunderstood and underreported legacy of Paul Volcker was to completely change the nature of the U.S. economy and its relationship to markets and to credit. Up until that time, as most people think is still the case today, and they're mistaken, but they haven't been told this. But up until that time in the early 80s, when we went from the first Paul Volcker to the second Paul Volcker during his tenure at the Fed, it used to be that the organic economy was the main driver, not only of economic activity, but of the level of markets and interest rates and so forth, because at least back then, and this is the way it's supposed to be in a natural world, the financial markets are a reflection of the health or lack thereof of the economy broadly and of individual sectors and companies within that. What Volcker did was turn that upside down to where now, with this securitized and credit-driven economy, and we hear it all the time since then and take it like it's gospel now and like it was always this way. But inevitably, the conversations always come to, well, the Fed has to do this to help the economy. The Fed shouldn't have to do this or that or the other thing. If the economy is healthy enough and independent enough, it takes care of itself. And the level of interest rates in the markets are set based on that, not the other way around. The level of stock prices are set based on the health of sectors in the economy and individual companies, not by how much money the Fed is printing. But that's the world in which we're in right now. So the traditional business cycle has been replaced by a credit cycle. And we've seen this repeat itself numerous times in the last 40 some odd years since Volcker changed the character. of things. You get a financial bubble that's unsustainable, something breaks, and boom, not down it comes and takes the economy with it, the economy that had been helped by the bubble. What's the latest example? Thanks to all the money that was printed and so forth that to allegedly save us from, the COVID pandemic and all that kind of stuff, we've had massive bubbles in asset prices. But each time these things repeat themselves, might correspondingly less benefit for the broad economy. Yeah, if you've got a stock portfolio, you feel like we got the greatest economy since, sliced bread and all that kind of stuff. But again, for half or more of the population, they don't feel that because when you depend exclusively or primarily on monetary prompting is a first matter, that only goes so far. And so then when everything gets stretched, it comes down. The problem is that when things reverse, and we saw this in 2008 in spades, of course, on the way up, it was the people that already had a lot of money or were doing well or were tied to new discoveries, new technologies, asset prices and stuff that benefited less than the average American. But on the way down, everybody took their hits. That's coming. We don't know yet in what form. Um, I think this is one of the reasons why out the back door, Powell has, when he says that even with four rate cuts or the equivalent of four rate cuts, 100 basis points, that they're still somewhat restrictive. Well, that's another disingenuous thing because out the back door, M2, the broad money supply, has still been going up at a very healthy pace for quite a while because he knows he's got to keep all this liquidity fed in there. But, at some point that doesn't work. What the US and Powell have had going for it to this point, and we've talked about this theme multiple times as well, is that right today, the US and the US currency and US markets are the prettiest horse in the glue factory. Everybody else is a mess. You've got full-blown currency crises in countries like Brazil and increasingly now up there in Kazakhstan, where you're at, where you've got a newly declining currency, even worse, thanks to the political upheaval up there, which in the end I think is going to be better for you guys, but it isn't pretty right now in currency markets. So that's the benefit that Powell has. And the question is, when does even that, situation of being relatively better than everything else that's a lot worse in the world, when does that itself no longer enough to fight the laws of mathematics and things just get so top heavy and something breaks? What that is, nobody really knows. I continue to believe that a crisis in China is at the top of my list of what will topple even the bubbles in the US, but we'll see. That's a whole different discussion.
Yeah, well, I liken the Fed to an offensive lineman. When everything's going good, you don't notice them. You only notice them when they get flagged for a penalty or they miss a tackle.
Great analogy. I'm going to use that.
Feel free to. Well, we're a month away from the inauguration, so 2025 is definitely going to have lots of stuff for us to be talking about. And if people want to follow your musings, where do they do so, Chris?
The easiest thing to do is a first matter. Simply go to nationalinvestor.com. You can sign up for my email list. You can find the links to just join me on social media. A lot of stuff coming out in the weeks and months ahead because, again, I think that the overly simplistic landscape of things that's been painted for not only citizens generally but investors particularly is going to be upended. I'm concerned about a lot of things as we get into the new year and reality sets in. And kind of as I said, and I hate to point this out because the long-term picture for most commodities I still think is very, very bullish, but a lot of good commodity stories are about to experience the same thing that I just alluded to when it comes to, a handful of the big boys benefiting on the way up in a bubble, but then everybody getting hurt on the way down. I think there's going to be some more bloodletting early in a new year of even good sectors and good stories as the overall market comes back to earth and drags them with it. And it's going to be a time where if you're in good stories, you need to sit tight and add more. You need to bottom fish and buy some of the better stories out there among commodity related ones. And again, more so realize that for all of the hope that I think Trump does legitimately represent to make one of the biggest changes in a lot of these things we've talked about in a very long time, the math is very much against him, and he's not going to be able, whatever bluster he puts out, he is not going to be able to change the laws of mathematics. So it's going to be important to gauge the health to come of the economy and the markets, commodity markets especially, to see just how far he's willing to go to, rather than engage in public spats with the Fed, which he will never win, to instead do an end run around the Fed and embrace things like an off the federal budget massive national infrastructure bank, which frankly is an idea that should be right up his alley when you look at how it's set up and what it does, where it's private sector money chiefly that will accomplish all the stuff he wants to do. And there's a lot of other things we can talk about, and we will talk about, won't we, shortly?
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to our chats come the new year. I want to best wish you and Dana a very Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays, and extend that to your very large family as well. And look forward to 2025 with you.
Thank you, and to all of you as well, Mike, and our folks out there. It's hard to believe that yet another year has come and gone, and here we are ready to turn the page on the calendar. It seems to happen faster these days as we get older.
Yeah, they say, once you get over the hill, things speed up. So,
Yep, they are.
okay, take care, Chris.
You too.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.